I used to work as a housekeeper in a fancy motel in Washington, D.C., back in the 1990s. My name is Sail, and I'm a refugee from Vietnam. Although I didn't speak much English, I was one of the hardest workers there. Everyone liked me because I was kind and I took great pride in my work. The motel staff trusted me, and even the guests would leave little notes, thanking me for keeping their rooms so clean. I worked long hours and rarely complained, knowing it was better than what I had left behind in my home country. One day, a mysterious guest checked into the motel. He called himself Mr. M, and he took the most expensive suite on the top floor. The suite was huge, with a view of the entire city, and only the richest people stayed there. I was assigned to clean the suite, but I quickly found out that Mr. M didn't want anyone inside his room. Every time I knocked, he would politely tell me that it wasn't necessary. He seemed nice enough, always smiling and greeting the staff warmly, but something about him made me uneasy. He stayed for over a month, and during that time, no one but Mr. M entered that suite. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the door like a warning, and I never pushed the issue. Then one day, Mr. M was gone. The sign was removed, and there was no trace of him anywhere in the motel. We assumed he had checked out early in the morning, slipping away quietly without needing any help. But when the front desk checked the records, there was nothing. No one remembered him leaving, and his name was not listed among the checkouts. It was like he had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind. The motel manager was puzzled, but since Mr. M had paid in advance with a credit card, no one made a fuss. I was asked to clean the suite. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Something inside me telling me that I should turn back, but I was a professional and I had a job to do. As soon as I stepped inside, a terrible smell hit me. It was thick and rotten, like something had died. I gagged and covered my nose, my eyes watering as I took in the sight of the room. It was a mess. The once luxurious suite was in complete disarray, as if a wild party had taken place. Furniture was overturned, empty bottles littered the floor, and the bed was unmade. The sheets tangled and stained. But the worst part was the smell. It seemed to be coming from the closet, where the door was slightly ajar. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it, every step filled with dread. The closet was dark, and the smell grew stronger as I pulled the door open. Inside, among the scattered clothes and shoes, was a cardboard box. It looked out of place, sitting there like it had been forgotten. My hands trembled as I reached for it, knowing that whatever was inside would be something I could never unsee. The box was light, but the smell was overpowering. I lifted the lid and immediately screamed. Dropping it as I stumbled back inside, the box was a large clump of hair, matted and filthy, with strands soaked in dried blood. The sight of it made my head spin, and I couldn't think straight. I had to get out, had to get away from that terrible place. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran for the door, but my legs felt weak, like they could give out at any moment. I made it to the elevator, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. As the doors closed, I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. But the smell lingered, and the image of the bloodied hair was burned into my mind. I couldn't escape it. It was too much. I fainted before the elevator reached the lobby. When I woke up, I was surrounded by people, motel staff, paramedics, and the police. The motel had become a crime scene, with officers swarming the suite, taking pictures and gathering evidence. The police questioned me, but I was too shaken to say much. They told me that Mr. M had used a fake identity and a stolen credit card to check in. The victim was identified as a bold movie worker who had been missing for weeks. The hair in the box was hers. a gruesome piece of a larger, darker mystery, I never returned to that motel. I quit my job that day, unable to face the horrors I had uncovered. The experience left a deep scar on me, one that I carried with me for the rest of my life. I never forgot the terror of that day, the smell, the sight of that box. It haunted me in my dreams, and no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever imagine. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. The storm had been relentless for hours. Rain pounded on the windshield as I drove down the L highway, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The wipers worked overtime, barely keeping the road visible through the downpour. I was on a solo road trip just trying to get away from everything for a while, but the bad weather and a car accident up ahead had delayed me more than I'd expected. Now it was well past midnight, and I was exhausted when I finally spotted a flickering neon sign up ahead. I sighed with relief. The sign read Sunset Motel, though the S was burnt out, leaving it as Unset Motel. I didn't care. I needed to rest. I pulled into the gravel lot, the car's tires crunching under the weight. The motel was a single-story, L-shaped building with a row of rooms, each door chipped and faded. The rain made everything look even more run-down than it probably was. The lights outside. The rooms flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the puddles on the ground. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the small office at the end of the row. The door creaked as I pushed it open, a bell jingling in above me. The place smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes. Behind the counter stood a man slumped in a chair. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were small and sunken, giving him a rodent-like appearance. His greasy hair clung to his forehead, and his thin lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Need a room?" His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. "Yes," I replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Just for the night." He nodded, reaching under the counter to grab a key. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it to me. "Cash only," he said, his eyes lingering on my face for a moment too long. I hesitated, but I didn't have many options. "Okay," I said, pulling out the cash from my wallet. As I handed it over, I noticed how his fingers brushed against mine just a little longer than necessary. It made my skin crawl. "Room 7, he said, pointing down the row of doors. "You'll be fine there." I muttered a thanks and hurried out of the office. The rain had let up a bit, but the wind still howled through the gaps in the motel's walls. I found room 7 easily and unlocked the door. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with a musty, sour smell that made me gag. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. The bedspread was tattered, and when I turned on the light, I saw roaches scatter across the floor. Disgusted, I backed out of the room, deciding then and there that I wasn't staying. The thought of lying down in that filthy bed made my skin itch. My car, though cramped, was clean and safe. I went back to my car, locked the doors, and reclined the seat as far back as it would go. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the room. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke up to the sound of hushed voices, groggy and disoriented. I rubbed my eyes and looked around. It took me a moment to realize where I was. Then I saw them. The check-in guy was standing just outside room 7, a flashlight in his hand. He was speaking in low tones to another man I hadn't seen before, taller and broader, with a hood pulled over his head. The check-in guy unlocked the door, and they both slipped inside. My heart raced as I watched them. What were they doing in there? My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were looking for me. The way they moved around the room, checking the bed, the closet, even under the bed, they were searching for something, for someone, for me. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of the car. My first instinct was to turn on the engine and get out of there. But I didn't want to make any noise. I forced myself to remain still, barely even daring to blink, praying they wouldn't notice the car parked a few feet away. Minutes passed, like hours. I watched as they rummaged through my things in the room, flipping through my bag and scattering my clothes across the dirty floor. Then the taller man said something to the check-in guy, and they both stopped. They exchanged a look. Looked before walking back out, closing the door behind them. The taller man glanced around the lot, his eyes sweeping over my car. I shrank down in my seat, willing myself to become invisible. Finally, they turned and walked back toward the office, their shadows long and menacing under the flickering lights. I didn't move until they disappeared. Inside, my hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I turned the ignition as quietly as possible, and the engine roared to life for a split second. I thought the noise would alert them, but when I glanced back at the office, there was no movement. I backed out of the lot, keeping my headlights off, until I was far enough down the road. My heart pounded in my chest, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to get as far away from that place as possible. The rain had stopped, but the night was still dark and heavy around me. I drove for miles before I finally dared to turn on the radio. I needed to hear something, anything, to drown out the terror that still clung to me as the morning light began to creep over the horizon. I found a diner and pulled in. I didn't have much appetite, but I needed to gather my thoughts. I ordered coffee and picked up an old newspaper someone had left on the counter as I flipped through it absently. One headline caught my eye. Local motel shut down after investigation. The article detailed how the Sunset Motel had been closed just days after I was there, citing suspicious activities and the arrest of the owner for human trafficking and other crimes. My blood ran cold as I read the words. I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a filthy room. I was driving back from a quiet farmhouse where I had spent the night alone. The farmhouse was peaceful, surrounded by open fields, and gave me a sense of calm. The weather was cool, and the drive through the countryside was pleasant, with rolling hills and the occasional farmhouse scattered along the road. I hadn't planned on stopping anywhere, but it was getting late, and I didn't want to drive through the night. As darkness fell, I decided it was best to find a place to rest for the night. That's when I spotted a small, rundown motel at the side of the road. The motel looked old, like it hadn't been updated in decades. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the neon sign flickered dimly, casting an eerie glow on the empty parking lot. There were no other cars around, and I wasn't sure if the place was even open, but I was too tired to keep driving. I pulled into the lot and parked near the office. Inside, the air felt stale, and there was a musty smell that hit me. The moment I walked in, the man at the front desk was old, with gray hair and a distant look in his eyes. He barely spoke as he handed me a key. I didn't ask questions, I just wanted a place to sleep. My room was at the far end of the motel. As I walked toward it, I noticed how quiet everything was. No other guests, no sounds from the road, just an unsettling silence. The door to my room creaked loudly as I opened it, and inside, it wasn't much better. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and an old bed with a lumpy mattress. A single weak lamp lit the room, casting long shadows on the walls. I thought about leaving, but I was too tired to care. I dropped my bags on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. The air in the room was heavy, like it hadn't been aired out in years. I tried to shake off the uneasiness that crept up on me. I told myself I was being silly, that I just needed sleep, but something didn't feel right. As I lay down, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me. I glanced around the room. The shadows seemed to move. With the flickering light of the lamp, I pulled the blanket over me and closed my eyes, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing slowly around me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. My eyes shot open, and I sat up in bed scanning the room. At first, I saw nothing, just the same old dreary room, but then in the corner, near the foot of the bed, I saw something move. It was dark and hard to make out, but there was something there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the corner, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but the figure became clearer. It looked like a person, hunched over with their back turned to me. I couldn't see a face, just a shadowy shape that seemed too real to be my imagination. It stayed still for a moment, then slowly turned its head toward me. My stomach dropped. There was no face, just a blank dark space where a face should be. I felt cold, my body frozen with fear. I finally forced myself to move. Scrambling out of bed and backing up toward the door, the figure stayed in place, but I didn't wait to see if it would move. I grabbed my bag and fumbled with the doorknob. My hands shaking, I threw the door open and ran outside, gasping for air. As soon as I was out, in the open, the night air felt cold against my skin, but I didn't care. I rushed to my car, not looking back at the room or the motel. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped out of the parking lot. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart racing. I didn't stop driving for a long time. The dark road stretched ahead of me, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing, just the empty road and the faint glow of the motel's neon sign disappearing behind me. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to spend another night in that place. Whatever I had seen, whatever was in that room, it wasn't something I wanted to face again. The rest of my drive was a blur. I didn't stop until I reached a town miles away, where I found a well-lit gas station and parked for a moment to catch my breath. I sat in my car, the events of the night replaying in my mind, trying to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The image of that faceless figure standing at the foot of my bed stayed with me. Long after I had left the motel behind, I had escaped unharmed, but the memory of that night would haunt me forever.